Welcome to Queer in Your Setting. My name is Joseph Carriker. I've been involved in the gaming industry since the very, very early 2000s, and have worked on a wide variety of games. I've done writing for 3rd and 5th editions of Dungeons and Dragons, all sorts of World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness material. I've written for Exalted. In the past 7 or so years, I've been involved with Ronin Publishing, where I developed both the Song of Ice and Fire role-playing game, as well as I am now the developer for the abundantly queer Blue Rose RPG. And I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Tanya DePass. I started I Need Diverse Games because I was mad about video games about 4 years ago, and I've expanded a lot into tabletop recently. I'm also part of the We Are All Monsters Here game that was just announced by James Gates a couple days ago. And I talk about diversity, inclusion, and queerness, and all of those things on the internet, and occasionally in panels. So here I am.
I'm Steve Kenson. I am staff designer with Ronin Publishing, where I am presently developing the Expanse RPG, now on Kickstarter. And I also have been freelance working in the games industry since the late Jurassic period, and am presently also lead writer on the new edition of Aberrant from Onyx Path.
Thank you. So, what this panel is actually the intention is to kind of do a couple of things. World building is a favorite thing of mine. So one of the things that this panel will look at is if you are engaged in world building, whether you're talking about you're doing, original work for an RPG, or you're a fiction writer, or you have any cause whatsoever to want to create a setting, we kind of want to look at what are the things to look out for when you want to include queerness in that setting. I'll be very upfront. I'm a very extensive reader, but I'm also a very snotty reader. I especially if there's any solid amounts of information on the setting, I want to know where queer people are at. If you, as a creator, create a setting, and you don't at least tell me in some footnote where we exist in your setting, because of the world that I grew up in, I assume that your setting is homophobic. I assume that your queer characters, because I will assume that they're there, are hiding. And then I will start doing the thing that queer people have done for decades and decades and decades, and I will start looking for the people who are signaling queer. And if you don't want me to assume that your characters, some of your characters, are closeted, then you'd better tell me who they are, who the queer people are. MCU, I'm looking at you.
Wow. just call them right out.
Oh, believe me, they know. Hashtag Stucky forever. The other thing that we want to do with this panel is, honestly, if you as a gamer or in any other capacity engage with a setting, and you kind of want to ask the question, where are the queer people here? Where are the interesting places where I might read queer people into it, put queer people into it? I kind of want to look at that as well. So we're going to kind of do a little bit of both, and we'll hopefully do it well.
Joe? Yeah. For the purposes of our discussion, do we want to define queerness?
I think so. Audience? Yes, I think so. So I am. It's first of all, if I will issue apologies if there's anyone for whom the term queer is problematic. I find it to be. Historically speaking, it was our word first. There are historical records of both of queer folks of both gender queerness and orientation queerness who used the term to describe themselves. It wasn't until bigots learned about our use of the term and then turned it into a slur that happened, and I refuse to cede ground to those people. They cannot have what is ours. So for the purpose of this panel, queerness is and sort of any identity, whether orientation, in terms of who one is or is not attracted to, because I do consider ace and demi folks to be queer, who you are attracted to or not attracted to, or whom you see yourself as with regards to gender, and any identities that are at odds with heteronormative overculture that often results in marginalization is what I consider to be queer. Okay. So there are kind of, when looking at queerness in a given setting, there's sort of a spectrum, right? And apologies for anyone who was just in our previous panel. We're going to cover some of the same material here and again. For me, that spectrum has sort of utopian settings in how they interact with queerness on one side, and repressive settings, right? So in utopian settings, nobody cares, right? It's not, your queer identity is not a thing to marginalize people over. And queerness may still have a distinct identity in utopian settings, or it may just be part of random human traits like what hand you use and what color your eyes are that nobody really cares about. On the other end of the spectrum is more repressive settings, wherein marginalization of queer people does exist. And frankly, there are reasons to create repressive sort of settings, primarily because, especially if we're talking about role-playing, we have heroes. And heroes are good at making bad things in the world around them go away and replace them with better things. And there is a distinct cathartic value, I feel, to having settings where that exists, as long as everyone at the table is signed up for it, right? You don't ever want to surprise queer people at your table with gross homophobia. It's an unkind thing to do, and it makes your table not safe, and I would not game with you. So there are benefits of both, and why don't we kind of maybe talk about the utopian end of things first? What would y'all say, what are sort of your thoughts on the benefits of utopian-type settings?
Well, for utopian type setting, it gives me an escapist place to go to. It gives me a spot where I don't have to deal with the trappings of the real world for a few hours, however often we play. Because it could also give a way to kind of think about what if, or think about what the future could hold, And my character can be gay as they want to be. No one's going to give them a hard time. They can walk down the street with their girlfriend or boyfriend, both, whatever shenanigans a character I create gets up to. And no one is going to give them grief. No one's going to be like, oh, you're gross, you're holding hands with another girl, or another orc or whatever. And that's freeing in a way, because I'm not in the back of my mind thinking, if I'm like a female elf and I've got a human girlfriend and we go into a human town, is someone going to give me grief if I kiss her on the cheek or something? So I don't have to think about that. It's one less thing, both mechanically and roleplay-wise, that is not something I have to bring to the table that I have to deal with in real life.
Yeah, I agree. And in addition to just the sheer escapism that utopian settings present, there really is a lot of power inherent in that what-if question of asking ourselves and then really exploring what would the world look like if we rid ourselves of homophobia, of transphobia, of misogyny, of racism. Because oftentimes, and I think this cropped up a bit, in our earlier discussion, we find ourselves, we stop for a moment and realize we're not entirely sure what that would look like, because we're so used to the way things are, that, even just the act of daring to imagine that world is a really significant step in manifesting that world. And I think that at its best, speculative and fantasy fiction has the opportunity to inspire us with visions of what could be. So I think it's very daring to think about, ways in which that world could exist.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like both in terms of how liberating it is and how aspirational. I think one of the things that I never counted on, in terms of benefits of utopian settings, was when I created a setting where queerness had cultural roles, but they weren't tied into marginalizing, was also how, quite frankly, healing it was. I had queer players at my table who had never even thought of what queerness might look like if it were freed from marginalization, right? Like, what does queerness mean when we're not tying it to this transgressive, rebellious, kind of countercultural urge, right? Like, in a lot of ways, our concepts of queerness are almost inseparable from that. I mean, we're pushing forward, right? Queer theory has been pushing forward in that regards in a lot of ways. But like, I think for each person who identifies as queer, even if we grew up in the most loving, welcoming environments, all of us eventually encounters, even if it's just at a remove, situations where that's dangerous, where it's unsafe, where it's a source of social strife or even physical strife, right? So like, to encounter a scenario in which you can play your true authentic self and there is no marginalization involved, right, is mind-blowing to some degree. So yeah, I would say those are like a great list of some reasons to sort of engage with utopian settings. On the other end of the spectrum, I feel that there are also reasons to play in, again, as long as everyone is informed and consenting, moving into it, to play in settings that are more repressive in that regard. What are y'all's thoughts?
I mean, I'm having a hard time. Yeah.
It doesn't even have to be a thumbs up. Like, your thoughts can be,
I was thinking. I was thinking while you were talking, and I'm sure in some settings it could work out. Mm-hmm. But I'm just thinking for me, and I'm thinking more for me as a player versus a writer or a GM even. For me as a player, I would not want to, but I have to consider that, especially if I'm GMing, what if someone at the table wants or needs to work stuff out through that, and either it's mechanically, through the way they play their character. For me personally, it's a hard pass, but if I'm GMing a game and someone wants to do that or even expresses a need to, then I would work with them, but as long as everyone else at the table consents.
I think it's interesting, too, to draw a comparison between actual repressive settings and sort of proxy repressive settings. Because for the longest time in fantastic fiction, we know the queer narrative has been used a long time, even absent its queerness. Because anyone who tells me that the X-Men is not all about queer people with superpowers doesn't know anything about the X-Men, or any other group of marginalized people with superpowers. Because the whole setup of the story is you are marginalized because of who you are. But it's the creation of a fictionalized category that no one in the actual world belongs to, so that it creates distance. And everyone who's marginalized can identify with those characters and say, wow, yeah, I know what that's like. But it's not them. So there's a little cushion between them, that, and their actual experience. And that's versus saying you are in a world where only queer people have superpowers and the Sentinels are hunting you down. That's a whole nother story, and one that I think can have a lot of power to it, but like Tanya points out, is also really fraught.
Yeah.
And, really you have to have absolute buy-in from everybody, in order to play that out.
Yeah, definitely. One of the reasons I find sometimes that having, in addition to what I kind of touched on earlier, right? Like having a culture, a civilization, a world in which bad things are part of the norm, regardless of what those bad things are, right? And having, in order to have goals for your heroes to go and push over, right? Mm-hmm. I feel like there are some other reasons to engage with those kinds of settings. In the previous panel, we talked a little bit about empathy play in particular, right? Presenting situations to some players who may have never had those experiences, right, who may have heard about them and they sort of intellectually know about them, but have never, engaged with them on a personal basis, can be tremendously enlightening. Now, of course, you still don't want to overbear anyone's comfort areas, right? And you still want to get buy-in and consent. But, if folks are willing to do that, and whether you do that with sort of the metaphor, like Steve was talking about, or straight up deciding that everyone's going to play a member of a marginalized group, and part of the play will be overcoming some of that and experiencing some of that, I feel like it can be distinctly worthy. That said, I do want to caution folks, your GM is not your therapist, and your GM should not try and act in that regard. So if it's a matter of we're all going to tell a kind of story and we're all going to offer our experiences and our points of view in that, awesome. If there's one person in the group, particularly if it's the one running the game, who is there to teach everybody, then it's time to kind of maybe put a little distance between that concept and the and the group.
Yeah. And I think it's important to make a distinction between stories that are emotionally powerful and ones that are emotionally traumatizing.
Yeah. Right. So, with that said, one of the other things that you kind of have to consider, as you go into this thought process, whether it's I'm creating a setting from the ground up, or I have an existing setting, and I kind of want to find a place for queer people in it, is how are we defining queerness? And we sort of made a point of doing so at the beginning of the panel, but it's worth noting that not every setting is going to necessarily do so in the same way. I think particularly when we start trying, and I say trying because I'm not convinced that we can fully do so. The trying to strip the marginalization and or the transgressive nature of queerness out of the identity. Where is that identity attached to then, right? It's like, if we understand that a culture has different aspects, right? So in our culture, queerness is othered, right? So it's sort of a scapegoat, it's sort of an outsider, it's sort of a, that sort of thing. Like for decades and decades, for centuries, discussion of queerness was sort of wrapped up in, honestly, in rebellion, right? It was rebellion against the ordained nature of mankind by God. It was rebellion against notions of, notions of family, and this sort of thing, right? So all of that kind of survives in our current identity as queer people to some extent. So the question then becomes, now either we're going to say it's not, the marginalization is gone, and we're just okay with it existing, being very accepted, but also being not particularly noteworthy as a result, right? I feel like there's some value in playing in settings or reading in settings where, people, where men can be attracted to other men, where the myriad of queer identities can be expressed, and no one blinks an eye. No one automatically attaches assumptions about you because of that, right? Mm-hmm. I think the other aspect, the other way of doing it, is to find something else to attach queerness to. Queerness is not the only aspect of our society that carries with it baggage, right? All kinds of different identities carry a variety of baggage, many of it bad, but some of it good sometimes, right? As a historical example, in the classical city of Thebes, there existed an elite military unit known as the Sacred Band. And the Sacred Band was made up of pairs of lovers, pairs of lovers who went into battle under the assumption that civic pride, like concern for one's government or for one's city or for one's gods, were not sufficient to prevent cowardice on the field of battle. But if I am on the field of battle with my lover, I'm going to fight for them, I'm going to fight for us, and I will never give in to cowardice because I would never want to either endanger or dishonor myself in front of this person. And to some extent, historically, apparently they were onto something, because the Sacred Band was terrified their neighbors, right? Ironically, I'll get into that later. Sorry.
It's like I'm just sitting here like
I'm about to go off.
You just dodged a rant.
But it's true. You really did. But as a result, an aspect of queerness, specifically that queerness wherein men have lovers, in Thebes was associated with military identity, right? Like, because the members of the Sacred Band, all they had to do in their culture was train for war, right? They didn't have wives, they weren't raising children, they weren't also trying to, be part of the economy, and as the rest of the military tended to be, because that's all they did, they were rightly regarded as terrifyingly skilled fighters. And so the pinnacle of sort of military achievement was attached to men-loving men queerness in Thebes as a result. So when it comes time to begin sort of building your setting, it may be worth it to find some aspect in your setting to sort of attach that to, right? What are some of your ideas? Because I will keep talking. So
I just started thinking about Amazons while you started talking.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and Amazons and the Dora Milaje, because we know that Marvel kind of swept the whole canonical queerness of the Dora Milaje under the table and out the door and in the sewer. And, I think it's in the comics. I'm that person, and don't yell at me, I will yell back. But I came to Black Panther and a lot of stuff through the MCU movies, but I went back and kind of caught up. So if it's in the comics, and surprise, there are queer black people. What? I know, right? But thinking that that's not something where it's like, okay, we can have a mostly black movie, but queer brown folks, that's just a bridge too far. We can't take that step yet. And so things like that, where it's like, clearly they didn't do this in Wonder Woman when we had the Amazons. And it's like, why can't you just
Say it.
Just say it.
Come on. Like, we all know,
Like, come on.
right?
I'm sorry, it's an island full of women out here fighting.
Right. They call it Paradise Island for a reason.
I mean, and look what happened. The dudes landed, and just everything went downhill from there. So I just feel like those kind of things where there's already examples, and it's like run with that, or don't be afraid, because what I'd like to do, and this is just my dream, if I ever can like sit down for 10 minutes and not have somewhere to go, is write like a brown lesbian pirate game.
Oh my God, yeah.
So I don't know, it's like a bunch of brown women on the sea fighting.
Right.
It's like I'd actually like to have it be men are cursed if they're on the ship. Because I always thought women were bad luck at sea.
Yeah.
So it's like, no, we
On
can't.
the ship, you were right. Or you.
Right. It's like, and then if a dude stows away, it's like, oh, this is a bad idea for you. So I have many, many ideas, but I'm like, why is it so hard to just say like, especially or it's flat out say bisexual, say poly, say fill in the blank orientation,
Right.
and then we always get rainbow to mean queer versus like various flags, and it feels like we can take this small step and have a rainbow on something, but we can't go the rest of the way and include everyone else.
Yeah.
So for me, that's always it's just like, okay, we'll give you this one very flamboyant, very like over the top queer character. It's usually a white dude, but we can't go any further and have anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to touch on that a little bit because we're also talking about the issue of queer visibility and with regard to assumptions, and that's one of the real challenges of representing queerness, because, like Joe said in the very beginning, we're everywhere, we're always there, but oftentimes we've become really good at hiding, often out of necessity, sometimes simply because some queer people blend in better than others. But there's an inherent visibility issue when it comes to queerness, in that queerness is often something that you do in some way, and is not always visible simply by your presence. And so there has to be an active reveal in one way. It's that you have to say it. It's not just enough to be like, well, yeah, that dude's kind of flamboyant. He could be. And that creates challenges, even in settings where if we take away homophobia, that does not guarantee visibility. It simply removes a barrier to visibility. There's no reason to be scared of being visible. But it doesn't take away assumptions if, however the percentages break down. But if the majority of people in a culture are heterosexual, then human beings, being pattern recognizing creatures that we are going to make assumptions. And they're going to see a person and they're going to, unless they have reason to believe otherwise, assume that they're straight.
Well, that goes along with the assumptions that people assume white is default, straight is default. Yeah. I'm bi, but I've got a male partner. So if I walk around with this dude, people are going to assume that you're straight.
Right.
And, people don't think about polyamorous relationships. They don't think about ace people in general. They don't think about agender or non-binary folks, because how often do we see someone who's not like the usual androgynous, like, what people think someone who's agender or non-binary is versus what people actually represent as.
Right. And so that becomes a significant thing to take into account when you're talking about including and portraying queerness, is actually portraying it. So I think we had a question. We're doing questions.
I was wondering if you guys have obviously thought about world building with creating a lot more than I have any thoughts on including a race that is mostly queer people, where straight is the minority.
Well, that's Blue Rose.
I mean,
so can we? The question was basically in terms of world building about including a race, and we won't even get into the problematic use of the term race for world building. That's a whole other panel. that is, essentially inherently or mostly queer in some fashion. So, and I think Joe had some thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, as Tanya mentioned, so the game that I am currently a developer for, and that Steve was one of the original creators of, is a game called Blue Rose, that on some level does basically that. The baseline assumption for characters in Blue Rose is that most people are bisexual. And that's sort of that's the honestly I hate the term, but that's the normal for the setting. So much so that there isn't really an in-term setting to describe that particular way of being, but there are terms to describe either heterosexual folks or homosexual folks. And while not marginalized, there are few enough of them that they do kind of stand out in the culture as sort of like, it's kind of quaint, and like, your uncle is one, and you kind of have to tell your friends about him, and sort of a thing. But like, and that's an opportunity, right, of doing exactly that. Like I actually do know one of those quaint monosexual people, and sort of a thing. So yeah. I mean, that's an excellent means of approaching like a very reasoned integration of queerness into particularly like fantasy settings, right? Like when I run D&D, I have a setting in which, much like kind of Tolkien's original ideas, the men of dwarven culture vastly outnumber the women. So much so that it's not nobody even blinks within dwarven culture for the men to sort of become involved with one another. In fact, queerness is, again, something I mentioned earlier, is attached to notions of very skilled craftsmanship, because since they're not going to be producing children, like that gives them way more time to focus on, their work at the forge or their gem crafting or whatever, right? And so in that sort of culture, not only is it if not a baseline assumption for all of them, then at least equal numbers. Not only is that, but it also sort of takes a kind of cultural touchstone, right? Instead of marginalization and othering, it's skilled craftsmanship, and it attaches queerness to that to some capacity, right? Because all the finest craftsmen are these pairs of men who've had done nothing for hundreds of years but work on their individual, and they challenge one another to each improve their skill, and blah blah blah, and it's a dwarf thing. But yeah, exactly. I think that's an excellent observation. It is a dwarf thing.
It's a dwarf thing.
Or letting people interject. You have another hand.
Yeah. Go ahead. Thank you. I appreciate that.
You could comment on claimed queer. I'm going to use species instead of race. Because I know that, I feel that Tiefling in D&D is a very queer claim.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
But it's also resulting from they're demonic and marginalized as well, but it's also got a kind of race aspect to it. It's nonetheless one of...
It does. No, it's an excellent example of people taking a type of fantasy marginalization and kind of reading their own marginalization onto it, which isn't a bad thing. Like I think it can make for really fun characters in that regard. And yeah, like being willing to place like types of fantasy or just fictional marginalization into your setting, as long as, caveat, you're not using them to replace a real-world type of marginalization, right? Yeah. Because fantasy, particularly fantasy gaming, is rife with those types of marginalization, particularly because it then means that creators and players and whatnot feel more justified in saying terrible things about that type of marginalization, and being able to retreat behind, well, I mean, they're not real, right? But when they've been created and put into that setting in order to replace a type of real world marginalization, yeah, it is real. You're just kind of hiding behind that. So yes, I think there is a value to that, and allowing them to be a mirror. Allowing them to be a mirror in which marginalized people can kind of see themselves in that regard.
Well, it's interesting that you brought this up because I'm on the show Rivals of Waterdeep, and it's all people of color. And one thing that we did is Sharif Jackson is our tiefling in the party, and we're trying to get into Waterdeep, and he actually pulled the "Are you profiling me?" thing because we all got like this kind of magical inspection, and they were like, "But a tiefling." And so, like, he especially got scrutinized, and, we pulled off, I don't know how we pulled this off, but we basically fooled the person at Waterdeep trying to check us out, make sure none of us are evil, because we're tiefling. But it worked because as brown people and brown folks watching this episode, we've had those uncomfortable moments. We've had the person follow us around the store. We've had the person ask, "Can I help you?" in that super cheerful voice. So I think it's interesting when the dynamic is different, because a group of people that are folks of color that have had that experience, that can be a moment where it's like, I get that, I understand that has happened to me, versus a white GM or white player trying to put that in for quote-unquote realism, because a lot of times when we have these, they're overlaying actual oppression, actual racism, for whatever reason the GM is doing, but that doesn't always need to be there. Now, had it been a bunch of white people playing, or a mixed group, and the tiefling's being played by a white person, and you did that, it would have been a whole different reaction. Because it would have been like, why would you do this? And it's like, oh, well, it's tieflings. You know how tieflings are treated. But again, it had a different impact because these are all people of color at the table.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and like Joe points out, there is an inherent danger that, just like you find corporations exporting toxic products that are illegal in a country to somewhere else where they think they can sell or dump them, you will find people exporting toxic notions of stereotypes to their fantasy equivalents, to sort of sanitize them and be like, well, yeah, I can make terrible queer jokes about this fantasy creature because it's not real, even though I'm still making horrible queer jokes or horrible racist jokes or horrible jokes about women.
Or all three.
Or all three at the same time, oftentimes. And that is obviously absolutely not cool. And you have to watch out for that in terms of fictionalizing marginalization.
Yeah. Right. So one of the other kind of elements that I wanted to look at, so a lot of our kind of discussion at this point has been sort of heavy in creating a setting kind of from the ground up. But a lot of it's, can be applicable to settings that you're already playing in. I will say, finding or injecting queerness into established settings, can take a little work sometimes, depending on the setting. There are some settings that started off very abundantly queer, and have been sort of sanitized as they were published. In particular, I'm thinking of the Forgotten Realms, because for all his faults, Ed Greenwood is an amazingly just open-minded fellow, and placed queer characters within his realms, and nobody blinked. Right, it was not even a thing that anybody looked at twice. Unfortunately, in the very early days of TSR, they were still sort of adhering to the old, gross comic code, in which any queerness, the hint of any queerness, was automatically a no. Like, this doesn't get published. So a lot of that has been sort of sanitized. But you can still find a lot of these materials. A lot of posts by Ed Greenwood online, and just lots of great places to find queerness. And if you look, The Realms is pretty queer. It's one of the settings I know really well in terms of one that's already established. But yeah. So part of the task at hand, if you're sitting down with a new setting that doesn't explicitly give a place for queerness, is deciding where you want to put it. Right, where is it going to exist at? If we're talking about running a game, it can be beneficial to do this with the help of your players, with the feedback of your players, right? Like, find out if anybody wants to play a queer character, and maybe let them help weigh in on where they come from. Right, if somebody wants to play someone with a nautical background, right? And maybe there's a tradition among those who take to the sea
of lesbian pirates of color.
Lesbian pirates of color. Please let there be.
Just saying.
But yeah, exactly, right? Like, and so finding the places where the setting has room for that, or even, frankly, making room for it, because it's your table, right? And so that can be kind of the first step, right? Finding out where do the players want this queerness to be, where do they want it to be, and then using real world history as an inspiration, right? One of the terrible tragedies of queerness as a culture, right, as a culture over the years, is that erasure is very real, and heteronormative overculture has done its best to erase us, and it's been wildly successful for one core reason. Lots of other types of marginalization are familial, right? Like, so it continues through families, and family histories are an easy way of upholding that, which isn't to say that overculture hasn't tried to destroy them anyway. That's definitely a thing. But by and large, queer identity, particularly in the past, has not included that. And so it was very easy for us to lose, a generation or two would develop a type of queerness, and then the culture around it would change, ugly repressive behaviors happen, and then it's all lost. But we can still find it, right? There are still historical records of some of that, although a lot of who wants to teach history these days do their best to not include that. There is, and I quote this book constantly, I refer to this book constantly, so, I feel if you're interested in setting building at all, there's a book called Blossom of Bone, and Blossom of Bone is a book about the historical role of gender queer people and orientation queer people in various pre-Christian religious systems. We talked about the sort of like, what role does queerness play when it's not marginalized, but also hasn't been just homogenized, right? Like, what identity is still attached to. And in a lot of pre-modern cultures, that identity was a spiritual one or a religious one. And Blossom of Bone is just literally, it's chapter after chapter of examples of where queer people fit into religious identity, into spiritual identities in a variety of cultures, right? From two-spirit traditions to the cult of Kaibele to on and on and on. It is a fantastic read, and yeah, I highly recommend it. Any other thoughts on kind of like ways in which, ideas in which to find a place for queerness in established settings?
I think just having it be part and parcel, maybe even a class, instead of like a species, maybe it's part and parcel of a class, kind of like with, sacred band where if you pick this subclass of a fighter, then surprise, you're gay.
Yeah.
I mean, I would enjoy doing that to people.
Right. Prerequisite.
I'm gonna go write that up. Like,
You took this class, now you're gay. Good luck. Or something, because in the panel we just did before this, someone asked about that in terms of bringing empathy to people.
yeah.
And it was a really good question. My only caveat with anything is if you're the GM, get, what is the word? Consent.
Consent, yes.
I'm tired. Get consent from your players because, without knowing the full context of why they want to do this at the table, it's a great idea, and maybe some people do need that empathetic teaching moment, but if you just kind of put this on someone and go, oh, well, you did this, so now we're going to have this storyline or plot with your character, maybe they're not homophobic at all, but they don't want this thrown at their character because maybe that's just not their interest in that campaign, and you can't force empathy. You can't force someone to understand, because what I find a lot, especially in unfortunate conversations I have on Twitter, especially in the tabletop space, is that people feel like you're forcing an agenda, be that about race, gender, orientation, queerness, what have you. An example is I was at another convention before this, and we talked about how to not bring racism into your settings. And it was very much don't be that person. Don't make all the drow evil, or all the black characters, they have a slavery background, they can't read, etc. And someone on Twitter decided that we were trying to force the agenda of making things racist. This was, I don't know how they went from A to F. I cannot explain this to you. Their username also gave away their political leanings. But
needed a neck brace after that.
Right? I read the tweets and I was like, how do we get here? But you have to deal with those things, and as a GM, your players are entrusting you to have a good time, but also keep them safe and everything else. So if you want to have that empathetic moment or teaching moments in your campaign, get consent, but also kind of think about why is it you're doing this.
Right.
Have people made homophobic comments at the table, and this is your way to kind of get them to come around. But if someone is biphobic, homophobic, transphobic, racist, fill in the blank of everything else they could be and be a terrible person, forcing them to do this at the table will actually probably backfire. Because we didn't get a chance to talk about that. You cannot wedge someone into an empathy hole, which sounded really bad the second I said that. But you can't make someone be empathetic if they're not.
That's true. In addition, talking about adding or expressing queerness in a setting, and especially as related to issues of erasure and just sort of overculture and all the other things, is also to consider the fact that we had to define queerness at the beginning of this discussion, largely because queerness is often defined by what it is not. And therefore it includes a really big, vast, sort of amorphous category. And it has expressed itself in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different cultures over the course of human history. And it's often a bit both lazy and short-sighted to assume that our understanding or expression of queerness is at all similar to what was found in other cultures and other places and other times. And even just the change that I've seen over my lifetime in the nuances in our community that are now being expressed, and the identities that people are finding their own expressions for, shows the tremendous range of possibilities. So don't feel like you're either boxed in, or don't assume that modern expressions of queerness are the only ones. We're going to keep finding them and developing them and learning about them. And unfortunately, it's still human nature to try and stick patterns on things and stick things into boxes. And even the queer community has a problem with erasure and with policing other people's queerness. And, saying, well, you are not queer enough to be counted among us, or your type of queerness isn't real. Mine kind is, but yours isn't. Or, your kind is a fad, and you'll get over it, or it'll change, but mine is lasting and has been here forever. And we have to watch out for that.
Yeah.
So, I am a self-styled terrible comedian, and as well as a visually impaired gamer, and I perform on Twitch. And I too have a setting where society is non-binary gender. So my question is, it goes back to the topic of humor. I've also kind of had the experience where, personally speaking, I have, been visually impaired and legally blind all of my life, and then I came out as gay later in life. People said, oh, that's something we never even thought of. White people are always straight or just don't have sex at all. Or You've been to a guide dog school training or anything? So, my knee-jerk reaction has always been use humor, use jokes as kind of a healing process. And you talked about how you stay away from jokes, and I, as a comedian, understand that. There is no place for jokes at the expense of anyone, and sporting at them is way different than just laughing with somebody. So my question is, how can we use humor, if at all, at this point in society's understanding of queerness, to sort of facilitate that understanding, facilitate that healing?
So the question is kind of, maybe rather than dodging uncomfortable topics, what maybe might the role of humor be in kind of engaging with them? And at least for me, I would say that like the roles of, say, a good therapist, the skill, or like the skills of a good therapist, the skills of a good comedian certainly have that healing potential, but most people are not that. And I think that there's room to say, by all means, bring what you're best at to the table, in support of that sort of thing, right? Like, we're talking about a lot of world building, so the skills that you may be talking about might be, artwork, right? It might be writing, it could be humor, it could be any of these sorts of things, it's being a skilled listener. But to not make the assumption, not make broad assumptions about everybody having that skill set, because I think that that sort of can backfire in ways that nobody kind of wants to see happen.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you stream on Twitch. I would be very careful with that, because while we may have in-group humor and things that are funny to us, either as marginalized people or with our friends specifically, it does not translate well on screen and to people watching, or they may get the idea that because you, the broadcaster, have joked about this, that they can then do it in your chat. I also stream on Twitch, so humor can be a great deflection, but it's a tool to use very carefully. Because there are jokes I will make that are terrible off-color jokes that I will say with friends or with, in person, but things I would never say during my broadcast because, well, people. Yes. And not that I'm a different person on stream than I am, like, I'm not going to say IRL, like off camera, but there's a difference between who you are when you are, especially if you're doing your tabletop on Twitch. It's a more performative aspect. You're not, it's not like we're sitting at this table with dice and beer and people are just watching us. There's a performative aspect that goes into it. So humor can be a great tool, just be very careful how you yield it, especially if you're doing this on a broadcast.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Tanya that the key thing is that humor is contextual, and therefore you have to read the room. And the kind of jokes that are going to go over well in this room are not going to be the same in a room with a different audience, and especially with Twitch, you don't even necessarily know what the room is like. It's very hard to read the room.
Well, you can read
you
the
can,
room,
but it's different context, and that's something to really be aware of. And I just wanted to touch upon something else that you brought up, is be aware of the intersectionality of queerness. Queerness is wondrous in the sense that it cuts across all categories. There are queer people of all genders, queer peoples of all ethnicities. There are queer Muslims and queer Christians and queer pagans. There are queer elders. There are queer people in every nation and every culture, from every background. So on the one hand, that is one of the wondrous qualities of us. But it is also one of those things that gets pushed aside and further marginalized.
Right. Intersectionality is a word everyone should learn if you don't know it already, and bring that into your work as GMs, as players, if anyone here writes games. Because what I'll find a lot of times is that someone has one identity, and that is the core and crux of their being. If they're queer, then it's like angst and woe and ennui and, oh my god, I'm gay in this setting, and nothing else will be the same, and that's their whole problem. Or if they're black, everything is about racism. And a lot of times, when you have those characters, because spoiler, that is not all I think about and all I do in a given day. But if you have a setting where racism very much exists, and that becomes the core of the character's issue while they're existing, we have to be careful not to do that with queerness as well.
Okay. Great. I think at this point, right to you. I'd like to kind of open things up generally. We've already been taking some questions, but let's open it up kind of for the rest of the amount of time that we have, and then we'll see what we get. Go ahead.
We talked about phrases, but trying to find a balance between avoiding erasure by just saying everything is fine and not discussing it, or by still creating an other by saying that if you are, for example, the dwarves where it's identified with skeleton. How do you find the balance between it, and how do you make that manifest not just from the top-down role-building perspective, this is what the role looks like, but in practice, where for example, running a game, I occasionally remember maybe I want to say that this man refers to his husband as opposed to just assuming a wife, or this person uses data, but I could be very aware of how to make it casual but still real for people to experience.
Well, I think part of that involves figuring out what the phrasing is in the setting, right? In the sort of dwarves that I mentioned, the pairs of spouses will often practice the same craft. So in the setting, for instance, if they're both smiths, they'll be referred to as forge mates. So my forge mate in the other room, I'll see if he's willing, to work on that chainmail or whatever, because I'm, busy up to here, right? And if you've already established within the setting, or maybe just the, player who is playing a dwarf is familiar with the term, right? That gives kind of a total, right? So once you've already established how the setting refers to such things, go back to it, right? Go back to it, use it over and over, and it can be sort of awkward to do up front, frankly. But I mean, but it's no more awkward than any other expression of whatever the culture is that you've created, and it's really just about using it within the context of the game in a way that players understand, and it gives them some hooks, right? I mean, the great thing about those details is that they are additional tools for immersion, and immersion is part of the fun of role-playing in particular. It's also part of the fun of fiction, right, is that it's a consistent thing, a frame of reference that comes up over and over again in a way that is a quick, latch onto for whoever's participating or engaging with it.
Yeah.
And I think just the way you mentioned, just casually, just change pronouns on things, and don't make a big deal out of it. That's the big thing of, you mentioned the innkeeper and his husband, or the tavern owner and her wife,
Right.
or her wives, or something, and that's just what it is. You're not making a big deal out of it, and you're not justifying their existence. That's what I find a lot of people will do. They'll bend over backwards to justify why this queer character exists, because, oh no, historical accuracy. There were apparently never queer people ever in the medieval times. Yeah, yes, that was sarcasm, by the way. But, just change pronouns, slide in there because you're running the table, and then obviously if someone is like, well, what do you mean his husband, then you can make it an empathetic educational moment. But most players will just run with it, and sometimes players don't pay attention. I know I'm guilty of it.
I mean, I don't know if this is apocrypha or not, but it's a fun story. Supposedly Chris Claremont, who wrote the X-Men for basically ever, used to have a poster that sat over his desk in his office that simply said, "Why couldn't it be a woman?" to remind him when he was writing to, include more female characters, to ask himself when he was creating a character, why does this character have to be a man? And I think that, expanding that notion to, give ourselves a mental post-it that says, whenever you're coming up with a character, even if they seem inconsequential, say to yourself, why does this character have to be the default whatever? Why do they have to be a man? Why do they have to be white? Why do they have to be straight? Say to yourself, hey, maybe they're not. And just introduce that into your game so that it becomes a regular, recurring part of the background. And, get your players used to the notion that the world is full of a diverse range of people that will serve them well when they walk away from your table, because the world is full of a diverse range of people, it turns out.
A couple of questions for you. How do you feel when, more or less as a player for the players, when your other players kind of start, getting on you, oh, well, let's play a queer character all the time. And for reference, my previous group was majority queer group. Only one straight. He never said anything about this. But however, yes. But I did sometimes get whacked because, from everyone else, because my peers are very queer. So how to deal with that when, people are tone down maybe a bit, or why is that so here, they're only queer?
That's a good question.
Well, what was the question?
So the question is kind of how would you sort of navigate it when maybe members of your own group are sort of harassing you for whatever severity of that you want to define. You're getting
pushed back.
Right. When, why are you always playing queer characters? That's all you sort of play it. And their example, in fact, was there's only one straight person at their table, and he's not the one who's giving the pushback. It's actually apparently these other folks. So,
I'd be like, have you not met me?
Right.
I mean, on some level,
yeah. I mean,
well, and that was kind of flippant, but why is it I should be forced to not play to my experience? Because a lot of times the text is not overt.
Right.
And if I want to be queer as a $3 bill in this setting, I'm going to go do it. And oh well, you can deal with it. And I would think anyone who's questioning why you always want to bring yourself into the setting, you may want to consider who you're playing with.
Yeah.
And other people, maybe for them, it's maybe they just don't want to be a gay character. That's cool. But we all have to sit at the table together.
Yeah, sure.
For me, I'm going to always be a brown bisexual as I can be character as long as you let me do it. And I can't think of a reason why no one would let me. But if someone's questioning, well, your character's always black and your character's always queer, why? Again, this is who I am.
Yeah.
And although I should in no way, analyze your fellow players, I'm going to, that, internalized homophobia is a thing. And, queer people are taught to censor themselves. And a lot of times I find that the queer people who are most concerned about the people who are most concerned about people's queerness are queer people who feel threatened because they feel like it's going to endanger them in some way, because we're taught to hide. Yeah. And that's a hard impulse to overcome, even among friends. So that a lot of times queer people will be like, whoa, can you tone it down? People might be watching, even though you're alone in a room together.
Oh no, we're being queer together.
Right. That's a thing, and it might be something for people to take a look at.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, my core response would probably be something along the lines of are we now a group that gets to critique one another's characters?
Because I have notes.
Right. And chances are there's going to be a very quick oh no, hold on, that's not what I meant.
That's when you go, well, what did you?
Right. Well, then where are we going with this? Right. Because at the end of the day, I play these type of characters because it's the type of character I want to play, and you literally need no other justification.
No.
Yeah. So honestly, just be yeah, it's cool. So maybe I'm interested in the place of these different types of queer characters within the setting. Maybe it's just the kind of character I want to play, and maybe it's not anybody else's damn business.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that actually is something we've touched on a little bit, but I think it's important for it to be very explicitly said that a character's queerness needs no justification. There does not have to be any reason in the setting, in the character's background, in the alignment of the stars, in any way, shape, or form for that character to be queer other than it's my character and I want them to be.
Yep.
Yeah.
Done.
And really, because so those of you who may be familiar with fiction arenas, when you introduce queer characters into fiction, there's so much pushback, because the question then becomes, why do they have to be?
What role does their queerness serve?
How does it serve the plot? And to the best of my knowledge, my queerness does not serve a plot.
Are you sure you're not a character in a game?
I'm pretty sure. But as I also like to, now I can be a little caustic on social media sometimes, particularly when people come for me with comments like that. And my response usually is, first of all, queerness is not plot development. It doesn't have to be tied to a plot. Second of all, the thing you're thinking of is character development. Character development needs no justification. It's merely interesting traits about a character to help readers empathize with them, and that's it. So in addition to being rude for attempting to critique this, you're also attempting to do so with bad knowledge of fictional constructions, so take it somewhere else. But yes, your queer characters do not need justification for why they are queer. And if they ask for it, then ask why players are choosing, what part of the plot is your character's straightness serving? Mm-hmm. And hopefully they'll begin to sort of see the ridiculously behind that idea.
You would hope.
Well,
yes.
I just want to add something because I just remembered something. And when I was playing, I always I hadn't come out to my friends. And I always played with characters that were female in order for them to engage in relationships with men, which was funny. And then afterwards, when I came out, I was like, well, my character is a bard and he's gay, by the way. And then the question was like, why is he gay? And I told him, why are you straight?
Right. Yeah.
And then, well, it's just genetics or anything. It's
Right.
not rolling a dice. And what I want to point out is that one of our friends who was a little bit I want to say different, he didn't have so much of an issue. He was raised really straight and conservative. He had a problem with me. He went away eventually, but But my game master was like, hey, you can't deal with that, but there's a door, you can stop playing with us if you don't want to.
Yeah.
He tried his best to adapt himself, but I think his background was way too low. Because eventually I just told him, dude, I just like cock.
Oh my God.
Right.
Well, now.
Like, I'm not eroding the ozone layer up in here. Yes. Right here up front, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah. So while it's very good practice to find places for queer people where it isn't explicitly stated, what do you think the best ways would be to combat certain publishers that may have purposely excluded queer characters, let's say in the past?
Don't buy their shit.
Yeah, stop buying this.
And make them aware. Make them aware that, you know, if they're stating that they're doing so deliberately, then don't buy their material, and make them know that you're spending your money elsewhere. And find those who are doing a good job by however you are measuring that, of including queer people, and give them your money. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, it can be frustrating, I know, because especially if there's a game that you particularly like, when, you know, some jerk shows up with an anti-queer agenda or other bigoted agenda, and they kind of take a great deal of delight in not engaging in good faith in that way. Then you just have to be really honest and be like, you know, that my money is going somewhere else, and it has to. So, yeah. Okay.
So in some of these examples that you brought up of like these queer character constructs like the Dorman Society and the City Thieves thing, it presents these very, I guess, cis-normative ideas that like men together cannot have children.
Sure.
I guess
Yeah.
How do we create these situations where we do create these things that embrace, like, I guess, same-sex love or whatever, but without putting these very cis-normative assumptions that a man has penis?
I'm sorry. You're right. You're absolutely correct. And that's, like, depending on where those sorts of expressions exist within the setting, should 100% inform that. Should 100% like if our dwarven culture has that space within it, i.e. there's a type of magic, or they've developed a sort of alchemy, or what have you, then like, that's a layer of richness. And admittedly, the individual creator may fall down in that regard, and may not engage with all potential possibilities, which is one of the reasons why role-playing is great, because the core of it is collaborative, right? And being able and willing to bring other ideas, bring ways of expanding those ideas to the table. Like, why wouldn't you, right? 100%. Yeah. All right. Yeah. And
going once.
We're good. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here.